much as I hate to do this, shut down active and interesting conversations, it's what we do sometimes in the classroom. So far we've described two sets of tools that you might really honestly be thoughtful about in your teaching if you want to engage your students' imaginations. The come with the body and the set that Kieran mostly discussed that come with an oral language. All your students have those when they come to your classes. I'd like to discuss now the next, and this is likely the one that is most vividly engaging your students. When we develop these kinds of understandings, it isn't accumulation, an accumulation that doesn't also involve loss. So for example, we begin with our bodies. When we develop an oral language, we lose something of the vividness that came along with making sense of the world through our bodies. I wish my mother had told me when I started to say mama that I could never go back to that kind of engagement in the world. We can never go back. Despite how much meditation we do, we try, but we can't completely go back to the body-based understanding because we have oral language that shapes the way we make sense of the world. Well, we now have, if you've developed the ability to read and write, as most have in our society, is a third kind of understanding called romantic understanding. And it is shaped by those tools that come along with written language. And it is a very distinctive kind of understanding, very different from mythic understanding. What I want to point out now is that it's very distinctive, but it also involves loss. We lose something of the very emotionally engaging features of language that are oral language tools. And so we would be wise in our teaching to continue to consider how to engage those tools of oral language as we also explore a new set of tools. Very quickly, a little bit about the transition. It's very unlikely that a typical 5-year-old will say to you, what means of locomotion does the fairy godmother use? Ella's never asked me that when I've read her Cinderella. It's not unusual, however, for a 9 or 10-year-old to want an explanation. It's not common for a 4-year-old to ask, what's the physics involved in turning pumpkins to coaches? Little Chloe, she went out when we planted beans. I shouldn't have planted beans because she was looking for the beanstalk. And I mean, the most I'm not much of a gardener, was like that much out of my beans. So she was very disappointed. So what we see then is in Cinderella, there is a feature of fantasy. And there's magic in the stories that engage the oral language user that are acceptable as long as the story is carried forward. The questioning of the magic isn't very common. But this changes when we take on a written language. Now, what we see is a much more concern with accommodations to reality. Because when we become literate, we have a much more vivid sense of the separate real world around us. We develop a sense of reality. And we have to somehow deal with that. And we need, for satisfaction in terms of how we make sense of our experiences, we need sort of descriptions of accommodations to that reality, what philosophers call an etiology. So now the kinds of stories that engage the older literate child would be more along the lines of Superman, where those features of fantasy are explained. Harry Potter, I mean, Hermione can always give you the tincture that is required to create the ability to fly. It's still fantastic, but there are certain accommodations to reality. We never ask how Peter Rabbit holds a cup of chamomile tea with his paw, and yet in Watership Down, Hazel and Bigwig, there are accommodations to reality. So there's different requirements on the way we describe in our stories and the kinds of stories that engage us. But the best way to explain it might be to say that we move from an interest in fantasy to a real fascination with the fantastic in the real world around us. The second thing I wanted to quickly mention was that literacy affects our minds. It radically changes the way we see the world around us. So, for example, if I said to you, what's the smaller word within the word window, and you said win, it wouldn't be a peak in your intellectual life to have noticed that. But the point is, in an oral language using context, if you say they would say, well, I don't know. I mean, it's a sound. It's a slur of sound. It's a behavior. We see it, because we're literate beings, as little squiggles, and little squiggles grouped together create words. And those words have an impact on how we make sense of the word and the objects we associate them with. So the ability to see the smaller word win within the larger word window is actually a reflection of how literacy has affected our minds. Another would be syllogisms. There's been studies done that say that when you become literate You can make sense of a syllogism. So, for example, if I said all the bears in the north are white and Novoya Zemlya is in the north, and I saw a bear there, what color was it? You might say white. But in this particular study, those oral language using individuals asked that question, said, I don't know, I've never been there. If you've been there, why don't you tell me? Because it's an ability that comes along with literacy. Now, again, this doesn't mean that this is hierarchically better. It's just qualitatively different. It's a different way of making sense of the world. So we should be able to maximize the precision and the clarity that could come along with the tools of literacy, and that's what our aim is. But we mustn't forget, too, that the emotional significance of those other ways of making sense of the world. So, very quickly, some of the tools that come along with literacy and that will really be engaging for your students. One is extremes and limits. The prosaicness of daily life is something that we need to be very wary of in education. And certainly in the elementary and secondary school levels, there's this belief that we should begin with what students know. You heard that? Well, if you want to bore them, that's probably a really good idea. But outside of the classroom, they're engaged with the fantastic, the extremes and limits of reality. They are interested in figuring out the bookends of reality. Have you ever met a 9 or 10-year-old who's interested in the Guinness Book of World Records? This person who's the smallest person, the tallest person, someone who has the longest fingernails. It's a means, possibly, of grasping the scope of this vast reality that one begins to make sense of as a literate individual. Now, everything we teach has extreme features. Weird, wild, and wacky aspects of it that we can draw out and draw our students' attention to when we're teaching. It gives them a means of emotional engagement with whatever we're teaching if we can indicate to them that everything around them has fantastic features within it. It's not really unusual, too, and I'll return to the idea of hobbies and collecting, that we see a fascination, maybe an obsession with collecting things. Starts about 7, peaks about 11, dies out about age 15. Most of you probably collected something. What is going on? We can ignore this feature of our students' imaginative lives in education, which tends to be the trend, or we can incorporate it into what we're teaching. I'll return to that in a bit. Associating with the heroic is another aspect, another learning tool that comes along with literacy. Now, if you can think back what it was like to be 11. Rules, rules, rules. You had to go to school when your mother told you. You had to probably wear what your mother told you. You had to go to class when you were told, sit in a certain desk when you were told. You feel confined by rules all around you. And yet this is when your sense of self and ego are developing. How do you overcome that? Well, it's not uncommon to associate with someone or something who can transcend the limits that hold you in. Whether it's Steve Nash or Lady Gaga, these people do not have to go to school when their mother tells them. Lady Gaga does not need to wear what her mother tells her. I don't think her mother picked out the meat dress, actually. So in some small way, the student associates with the transcendent human quality, and it's not the person, it's not Steve Nash, but it's the strength, the agility, the compassion of the person they consider to be heroic, because they can experience in a limited way that same human quality. It's a means of overcoming the sense of feeling confined. Most students we see have their idols. They have the rock star, the musician, whatever it may be. Sometimes it's an organization because it stands for something that they can emotionally connect with. So an example that I like is I taught social studies for a lot of years, and it's how do we begin with what students know and teach about World War II. A lot of students will never have to experience war, we hope. But they can share, if we consider the courage, maybe it's a little too stereotypical, but the determination of a soldier. They can share that sense of determination or courage if we frame our teaching in a way that draws out that transcendent human quality. So what is it within what you're teaching that might be considered heroic? Is it the tenacity of a single-celled organism? Is it the determination of an explorer? Is it the, as I'll talk a little bit later on about, the courtesy of punctuation? Is it the clarity or the illuminative power of assessment? What is it about what you're teaching that is heroic? We're going to do an activity in a little bit that will give you a chance to do this. Romance, wonder, and awe. At this stage in our lives, I mean, life is a great heroic journey. we're surrounded by magical and fantastic things if only we can turn on our ability to see those. This is a nice example. Many students, maybe yourselves too, think this is a cup with cold tea in it. It's actually a feat in engineering, chemistry, physics. The fact that we can hold scalding liquid, just millimeters, fractions of a centimeter from our fingers without being burned, is a wonderful example of the ingenuity of human thinking. Can we not turn on students' interest, drawing out the uniqueness of the ordinary things in the world around them when we're teaching? My aim when I taught that assessment class was to have them feeling, at the end of it, fascinated with classroom assessment. Because it is much more interesting. And I went in thinking, okay, this is going to be a challenge. But I came out feeling like it is really actually fascinating. What we do in our classrooms, despite what we believe about learning and what children and ended up, students did leave feeling something for something as ordinary as testing. So anyway, can we do that? And can we help them see sort of that glimmer of the fantastic in the world around them? Matters of detail. Very quickly, this refers back to the idea of collecting and hobbies. It's very common to have collected something when you were younger. Anybody collect anything? Yes, so what did you collect? It's always nice to ask this question. Turtles? Never had that one before. Like alive? Oh. Okay, turtles. Stickers, anybody? I had my stickers. Anybody else? Coins. Rocks. Marbles. Baseball cards. And my daughter, who is Ella, who's now very literate, she's begun collecting everything. It's fascinating how she's collecting things, erasers here and pencils here and Easter egg wrappers. They're glittery in another container. It's all these succession. What is going on? Well, there was one study done in 1907, Caroline Fryer-Burke, who looked at the educational implications of this fascination with collecting. And there's been nothing since. But it's something that we tend to do and something that gives us confidence in this vast wide world around us. Well, there's been something since, and I'd say it's the Learning in Depth project, something that we've been talking about more and more in the last few years. How do we provide students opportunities to learn something exhaustively in our classrooms? There's always some aspect of something you're teaching that you can have them collect. Some aspect of what you're teaching, some aspect of that knowledge they can go and become an expert on. You're tapping into their interest in collecting things, and in this sense, you're supporting them in learning some aspect of the topic in more detail than anybody else around them. And I think the last tool we'll talk about is humanizing knowledge. Now, if you can imagine for a moment, it's really not much of a stretch, that it's raining. And you're walking down Broadway, and it's actually come on really, really strong. You weren't expecting it. And you're soaked. So you go into a bookstore that happens to be on the road there. And as you enter the bookstore, you shake off your coat, close your umbrella, and you notice the odd smell of sort of old books and wet hair, and just an odd sense of, the number of books around you. You're sort of flabbergasted. But you might wrongly think that you're surrounded by knowledge. There's no knowledge in any of those books. There's no knowledge on the internet. Knowledge only exists in the human mind, tied up with human emotion, hopes, fears, and passions. A lot of people say, how do we use the tools of the internet? Well, it's never really been accessing knowledge that's been our problem as educators. It's making knowledge meaningful that is our challenge. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is to connect whatever it is we're teaching with human hopes, fears, and passions. Someone, somewhere, had something to do with the topic you're teaching. Someone somewhere invented, created, developed, struggled with, whatever it may be, the topics you're teaching. And if we can bring those experiences, those stories into your classrooms, we tap into this feature of students' imaginative lives. I hope our classrooms will be full of ghosts, of those human beings that may be alive but aren't here. Bring them into the classroom, bring in their stories so that you can humanize the knowledge for the students. This is just one of the quotes that's been taken out of Kieran's work, and it's been used a lot, that all knowledge is human knowledge. It's sort of a curse that we tend to think about the book and the human mind as similar. But once you write something down, it stays the same in that book. Or that the mind is somehow like a filing cabinet. We just slot things in. It doesn't work that way. The mind is an emotional and imaginative structure, and so we need to consider how to connect emotion and imagination to the knowledge we're teaching.